As part of the negotiation series, this episode is going to cover the kind of preparations that you can do before sitting down for a negotiation. These are going to ensure that things just work more smoothly, efficiently, and that before sitting down at the table, you're really clear about what your goals, your parameters, desired outcomes, boundaries are going to be, and you know whether you need to walk away or not, and at what juncture that might well happen. The first step in making preparations is going to be a general assessment of the background. This is going to include reviewing the steps that led you up to the point of negotiation in the first place. What's been said, what expectations may or may not be already in the mind of the other party or in your own before you walk in the door. Just double checking that all the decision makers that are necessary are going to be there at the outset, and if not, when they will be available. This is going to have some impact as to the course and length of the negotiation, depending on if all the people are there at the first meeting. Research on what is happening in terms of other existing vendors or suppliers that this company or organization may be using. If it's an industry that you're competing in for some time, you should be familiar with what are the typical strengths and weaknesses of the other vendor supplier that you could be up against. Also, general research background on the company involved, and if you can, on the individuals that are going to be there in the first place. That's just going to help build rapport when you get time to sit around the table. It's also worth having a really frank assessment of where you feel you may sit on the continuum of control in the situation. In other words, do you have minimum control where you just have to accept what the other side is going to dictate? Or do you have maximum control where you're in the situation where you're doing the dictating? In the real world, chances are you're going to fall somewhere in the middle. And it's worth bearing in mind that our expectations of where along that continuum we sit can really be a bit wrong. So, for example, it's quite easy to imagine that if you are the seller, the vendor, and you're dealing with the buyer, the buyer has 100% of the power because they're making the purchase decision, and you really have zero power. That's really true because, you would not be sat down to the table having the discussion in the first place if you didn't have something of value. And it wouldn't be a negotiation if it wasn't for the case that you had maybe something to offer, they had something to offer, and you're going to be finding that you're meeting somewhere in the middle. Reverse is also true. Some people will go into a negotiation feeling that they have all the cards on their side, and actually be quite surprised when something unexpected happens and they realize that, well, actually the other party doesn't have to accept their terms, they could walk away, or the other party introduces new information or options or thinking that the person who felt they were in control didn't consider at the outset, and that can be, again, a total game changer. Preparation is also the time period when you're going to decide who is the team that's going to go into this negotiation on your behalf. Maybe it's just a simple one from your side, one from their side. That's fine. But in many cases, there will be, multiple players and factors involved. So, for example, I've often found it quite useful if I can to bring my boss to a, particularly tricky or important negotiation. Why? For a few reasons. One, it shows, just how seriously that, we're taking things. I'm going to take someone who's got more, clout to roll power in the company than I do. It also means that if something comes up that, I haven't got the authority to sign off on, I'm not having to do a ping pong back and forth to have an internal discussion. Sometimes we can come up with an answer there and then. It just makes it much more efficient. On the other hand, it may be the case that you also want to bring someone who is perhaps junior to you, give them some exposure, some training, make them aware of the negotiating process through first-hand experience so that, they're more likely to be able to take it on by themselves in the future. Maybe they're good enough that you can delegate the entire process to them after some time. Maybe that person actually has a better relationship or an established relationship with the other party than you do. And, it's really critical to have that person in the room with you, even though in terms of role power or hierarchy in the company, they might not have, necessarily otherwise been the decision maker at the table from your team's side. Sometimes you'll also see this, this bizarre power play of numbers. You have this iconic image of, people walking into a law firm where, around the table there are, 10 people in suits all looking stern, and probably 7 or 8 of them have no idea what's going on. They're just brought in there as bodies, as numbers, as a show of force to try to intimidate the other party, and make them back down, and then, this can escalate. If you ever see that the other party is really going out of their way, making an effort to try to intimidate you, I would always take that as a compliment, actually, and just move on from there. This is also the time period when the venue for the negotiations is going to be agreed between the parties. Perhaps it's at the one or the other, or indeed neutral ground. Neutral ground is quite nice for just establishing a sense of, parity and openness between the parties. But, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes, it's necessary for you to go to the other party's, place of strength, their work, their head office, what have you. And sometimes you'll encounter, quite orchestrated sequences of timing and space and temperature and light designed to put you at a disadvantage before the negotiations begin. I remember hearing a story recounted from someone who is in fast-moving consumer goods, who's dealing with the major supermarkets, and they had a special waiting room for vendors, and it was hot, airless, stuffy, windowless, soulless place, and they made them wait for their appointment way beyond the allotted time, just to try to throw them off their game, to weaken them, to make them more likely to give in and give up once it came time for negotiation. And again, if you see that the other party is really having to go all out to try to put you at a disadvantage or intimidate you by virtue of how they've orchestrated the venue, again, just beware that is a compliment. Also, in terms of venue, you want to make sure that if you've got a team, with you, you need to have a private space and time before the meeting as well as after, so you can just discuss everything that you're planning just to have a quick recap of the gameplay beforehand, and then a review afterwards, where everyone, while it's still fresh in your mind, is going to run through what's said, make notes, put everything together, and know where you're going to go from here. And doing that fresh is really great, instead of waiting several hours till you can get back to your own head office. And if you're over at the other party's place of business, I would absolutely suggest that you do these activities somewhere else. Do it at a cafe just outside beforehand, and then the reverse afterwards, or get together if there's only a few of you in the car or what have you, just so that you can conduct these conversations in private. It's also really critical to have a clear understanding of what your goals are before walking into the negotiation room. Just sitting down and knowing what you really want out of this. Trying to anticipate, if possible, the other party's wants and desires. It's just going to help when you get into the room to see how much potential mutual ground you've got, or how wide the gap is between your expectations. And if you've thought about that beforehand, you're just going to be in a better frame of mind, knowing what are the boundaries for any concessions that you would be able to make, rather than think on the fly or recheck and come back and so on. It just makes it much more efficient. In the back of your mind, you've got a really clear indication of how far, how low, how high, etc. you're able to go, just so that you can keep to those boundaries when you're in the talks. And also bearing in mind that the ultimate goal of the negotiation is not necessarily to do a deal. It's to maintain and promote your business in the long run. And a bad deal is going to be much worse than having no deal whatsoever. You'll often hear the acronym, the BATNA, BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Knowing that if you can't get a deal, what's going to be the best possible alternative course of action that you can take instead of that. And if that's clear in your mind, if things start to go really sideways, or you realize that the other party just has no intention whatsoever of giving in, playing fair, negotiating in good faith, and you're just looking at a bit of a nightmare scenario, then that is your cue to walk away. And if you know when your walk away point is, then it's really clear. It's simple. If you've reached that point, then without emotion or anger or recrimination, you can just let the party know that, hey, actually this isn't turning out as well as we'd hoped. So, rather than waste each other's time at this juncture, we're totally open to speaking to you in the future. But, at this point, we're afraid from our side, we're out. And, thanks for your time. And let's regroup on this in the future if there's some mileage in doing so. In summary, during the preparation phase of a negotiation, we just want to be really clear in our minds before going into the room what the background to the situation is. We've done our research, so we're feeling confident about where we stand and what could be the potential situation that we're dealing with. We want to know where we lie on that continuum of control or lack of control in terms of negotiating leverage. Be clear about who our team is going to be. Also, the role that each member of that team is going to play once we get into the room. Be clear about the venue and what advantages or disadvantages that may have or bring to the situation. And finally, be absolutely clear about what our own goals and priorities are, what our boundaries are in terms of concession, and what our walk-away point is. Because if we need to do that, we have to come to that point with grace and just leave on a good note with the door open for future negotiations if that's going to be beneficial.